in September, we'll be having the elections in Edo State. And of course, in November, we'll be having the elections right there in Ondo State. So that's the conversation we're having, the level of preparations. And one of the people that have been watching that space, a civil society organization, will be joined in the program by the Director of Programs of YIAGA Africa, Cynthia Mbamalu. She joins us from our Abuja studio. Cynthia, good to see you again. Thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you. Good to see you too.
Well, let's begin by what civil society is saying as... let's begin with that concern about level playing field. So if you've been following the news, you realize that both the Labour Party and the APC at some point were concerned about level playing field, where they were complaining, especially Labour Party, that some of their billboards were vandalized and all of that. I wonder what the take of civil society organization is on this and what you see play out in that state. I'm talking about Edo State for now.
Well, I'm glad you raised that. I think it's important. First, I mean, one major principle when it comes to elections is that the process is free and is fair. And the idea of fairness is that every candidate, every party, every contender has an equal opportunity to campaign. I mean, the process, that's one of the factors to look out for. And unfortunately, part of what we're beginning to see is one, there's this increasing political tension in Edo. I was in Edo last week, and just interacting with stakeholders and citizens within the state, you can feel that undertone of political tension within the state. There are two variants to this. There is the intra-party conflict that has also heated up the polity, and then there's the inter-party conflict. But then the question around the freedom and fairness of the process, I think, is an issue that needs to be addressed, because for every electoral process, and one of the things that ensures the credibility and integrity of the process, that every party and candidate is given a fair chance to contest and canvass for vote. And while you're driving through the streets of Benin, you can see the posters of at least the APC, the PDP, the Labour Party. However, one of the things we were observing were in some locations, you see the posters of the other parties either torn or destroyed. And sadly, this is not an incident peculiar to just Edo elections. And I think this is a bigger call to political parties and how they view the electoral process, as whether they see it as a democratic process or as a militarized process. And what we've seen in Edo, if you follow the last off-cycle elections in Ekiti, Osun, and Anambra, in fact, in Anambra, at least Anambra had the APGA as the ruling party at the state. There were also complaints. And so one of the major lessons is that political parties must understand that when it comes to the elections, they need to ensure a fair and free process for other contenders, regardless of who is a ruling party. Because today, there may be complaints from Edo, because you have the PDP as a ruling party. But if you go to another state where you have the All Progressives Congress as a leading party, you would also get the same complaint. And I'm hoping that for these elections, that INEC engages the political parties to, one, sound out the rules of the game. The Electoral Act is clear. Every party has the freedom to campaign within these 150 days required for campaign before the elections. And that state government should not use the instruments of the state to intimidate or limit or restrict the campaigns of the other parties. We have 17 parties, candidates and parties in this election in Edo State, and each of these parties has the freedom to contest and campaign across the 18 local governments in the state. And I think it's important, the ruling party in Edo State, and even as we also look to Ondo, that each of these parties understand that using the instruments of the state's power to intimidate others is an infringement of their fundamental rights to be voted for in an elections.
Cynthia, I'm wondering who is going to call the states to order, as you've rightly posited. When is a particular, if it's APC, there's complaint about APC. If it's PDP, there's complaint about PDP. INEC itself looks to be like there's no capacity to effect some of these restraints on the political parties as much as possible, because they themselves even need help to be able to carry out their own duty. So my question is, who is going to call them to order and insist besides INEC? Well,
if we're being honest, by law, INEC is the umpire. And what the umpire does is to ensure, like the referees, to say, oh, you're wrong, you're right, and get this done. This is the rule, which is why INEC releases a code of conduct for campaigns. INEC releases the policies that regulates the campaigns to support the elections, the Electoral Act and the Constitution. And so one of the things that is expected is there are fines in the Electoral Act for specific offences, especially as it relates to even intimidation and vandalization during campaigns. And it is by law, the Electoral Commission is actually the umpire that needs to sit up to call the parties to order. I know INEC has platforms in which it engages with the political parties. However, there is also the conversation around, because I wouldn't want to call on the federal government or anyone to do that, because I need to stick to what the law says. And in a sane climb, where you have individuals who respect the rule of law, we shouldn't even be having this conversation. But unfortunately, our politics is not necessarily a sane climb. And so it also behoves on the government, the incumbent, the ruling party, to understand that intimidating or restricting the other political parties in this state also is an indication that the party does not care about the Constitution and it's not democratic, because also no matter how you conduct yourself, if you're not democratic in your conduct, then it also means that you don't believe in democracy. And so at this point, INEC has that responsibility to call to order, but you also have the security agencies who have the power to make arrests. Because when you see vandalization and disruption of processes, where campaigns are held and their campaigns are disrupted, that means there is a crime, there's an offense. It also behoves on the security agencies to also make arrests, because when you begin to make arrests, it deters those kinds of conduct and reduces impunity in the system. So INEC has its role, but you have the security agencies that ought to also play their role in bringing peace and order in the state.
I would like to have your view on what you see playing out. It appears to be there are about 16 or so political parties in this race, but this may end up being a three-horse race, because we're seeing impressions from the Labour Party through Olumide Akpata, Asue Godala of the PDP, who is of the ruling party, and Monday Okpebolo of the APC, and all of that. So in your analytics of what is going to play out in terms of the voting bloc, do you think that this election will be different from the one we saw the last time? Because from the data we have, we saw that maybe about 10% of the entire population, if you take a dose, will be about 5 million people both in diaspora, and about only 500,000 people voted. In terms of voter apathy, do you see that playing out this time? Or given how intense the race looks, people will actually come out to vote?
Sadly, we're already seeing projection of low voter turnout. And if you look at the data from the last elections, and for the presidential elections, Edo barely had about 24% turnout. The 2022 governorship elections was about 25% voter turnout. So we've seen, and that was a decline from the 35% they had in the previous elections before the 2020 governorship elections. And in the states, already there is that I wouldn't necessarily call it apathy. I would call it more like disinterest. So there are three factors for me. One, there's a growing disinterest amongst the voting population when it comes to engaging in the process. And it is directly correlated with the fact that there is that lack of faith in government to deliver the goods and services that meet the needs of the people. So when people do not trust that their elections would produce an outcome that gives them good leadership, then they do not have that interest to participate. The second part is a question around the lack of faith or dwindling lack of trust in the electoral process. If you remember the last presidential elections last year, Edo was one of the states that experienced incidents where voting processes were disrupted and elections materials destroyed in some polling stations. That has left some impact on the voters' faith in the process. And also, post that elections, there were lots of questions around some results in some of the locations in Edo State. So that level of lack of trust is also affecting how citizens are engaging the process. And I think the third part is the economic crunch. Now, we already know the economic realities. You meet the average person in the state, they are not thinking of elections. They're thinking of how to get the next meal on the table. And so there is going to be that direct impact of the economic crisis on how voters engage and even how voters turn out. And I think I forgot to mention part, which is insecurity. Because in Edo State already, one of the findings were receiving activities of cultists in different locations, kidnapping, locations like Esan East, Esan West, Esan Southwest, Igweben. We're getting more reports of cultism, and some of them are already indirectly impacting on the process, because while you may call it cultist activities in a sense, we already know that there is a political undertone to some of the rising cases of that. And then the insecurity that has affected even how farmers farm in some of the farming community. And we also have header farmer clashes in some communities. So this security context also has a direct impact on the process. And if you ask me what will be the projection, I'm worried that Edo would not even get 30% turnout in these coming elections. But I mean, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
It's quite unfortunate, because when I look at the number, how just about slightly about 10% of an entire population decided who governs them for the next 4 years or more. Before I let you go, the issue of the integrity of the umpire itself, I want you to speak to that. Isn't that also a concern for the voters in Edo State? Now, look at what played out in Adamawa State with Yunus Ahari, whose case is still under adjudication. We saw clearly what played out. I remember I was on DC that day, and we saw everything that played out, and people felt that by now that case should have been done and dusted. It's still a subject of adjudication. To the best of my knowledge, I stand to be corrected. So, at the end of the day, how confident do you think the people are in the electoral umpire themselves? In about 1 minute, if you can.
I think to respond to that, I would just put the responsibility on the Electoral Commission. INEC has a lot of work to do to rebuild trust in itself as an institution and in the electoral process. And what INEC requires to do this time around is to begin direct engagement with citizens across the local government and showcasing what it needs to do in the elections. That's one. The second, we want to see the electoral officials conduct themselves with high sense of integrity and devoid of any form of partisanship. Because one of the questions around INEC's integrity is the question around partisan characters from some of the officials, and the fact that the last elections, issues that were raised were not addressed. So for me, what INEC needs to do now is to invest in building confidence in itself as an institution by ensuring adequate and timely communication and engagement with voters. Voter education must be priority in these elections if INEC wants to even ensure that it conducts an election in an environment of trust. Just
in closing, this particular one of the issue of accountability given to the issue of rhetorics. We're about to see rhetorics play out very soon when this campaign starts. A civil society organization, on your part, are you curating these things? And is INEC doing enough to make sure that there's civility in the rhetorics of politicians? Because at the end of the day, they'll just say it's just a means to an end. After the election, I've heard people say, let that not define us. But people were killed, people were maimed.
Honestly, to address this too, because I believe in holding people accountable for their actions. That is where the security agencies come up. The laws are there. It empowers arrest. It empowers penalties for those who heat up the context, or who even use rhetorics of hate and destructive and violent rhetoric. So there is that part, the need for arrest. But I wouldn't necessarily put the blame on INEC now. Honestly, it's a call to our political parties. I believe that our political parties and politicians most times are oblivious. Either they are oblivious or they are just mischievous. I mean, heating up the polity, knowing that that would leave a lasting impact on how citizens even interact post-elections. These elections is a call to political parties to conduct themselves with some level of civility and responsibility. One. The second is parties should devoid from arming thugs, because when they arm thugs, post-elections, they never retrieve these arms, which is one of the things that spill over into the level of insecurity that we see. You see these kidnappers, a lot of them some of these are arms that were amassed during elections. And I think it's also time we begin to hold our political parties accountable for how they heat up the system and create insecurity in the process.
Cynthia, thank you so much. I think a day will come when we'll talk about thuggery, arming thugs, and being in cahoots, those thugs being in cahoots with politicians, because it's a never-ending conversation. It seems not to be getting better, but we hope it's going to get better. Cynthia Mbamalu is the Director of Programs of YIAGA. Thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you.